All right, good morning everybody and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. My name is Saumweber. I'm the director of the Stephenson Ocean Security Project here at CSIS. A couple quick safety announcements. I have to say that in the event of an emergency, highly unlikely, please follow the exit signs on either side here and out the front door. This is the 4th annual Stephenson Ocean Security Forum, and it's wonderful to be here, wonderful to reflect. We had this conversation now for the past 4 years, and I think we've really seen tremendous progress in the idea that ocean health and sustainability is a fundamental element of ocean security, of our foreign policy, of our national security in the maritime space. This is a project that we've been working on and thinking about deeply in that time. I think there's been a real evolution in the U.S. government's approach to these concepts. What we're going to do today is we're going to take a little bit of a step back, and we're going to think about how this concept originates and where it comes from. We're going to talk about the idea that not just in the ocean sphere, but more broadly, natural security, the idea that the health of the global environment with respect to climate, with respect to ecosystem change, with respect to the health and security of people around the globe is fundamental to a global security platform. And we're going to start off today with a conversation with the wonderful folks here to my right, Ann Christianson, Rod Schoonover, and Sherry Goodman, talking about that concept and about how it's evolved over the past year. And then we're going to flow from there into a conversation after a break with the co-chairs of the Maritime Safe Working Group, which is a U.S. government panel that's been empowered by the Maritime Safe Act to think more directly about IUU fishing and its role in our national security here in the United States. So just a brief welcome there, and want to say thank you. We'll have comments here by our first panel, then we'll have question and answer, both online and in person. We'll have a brief break at 10 o'clock, and we'll start a second panel at 10:15. So thanks again, welcome. Really appreciate you all joining us here today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Ann Christianson to moderate our first discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Whit. And thank you all for coming this morning. I'm really delighted to be moderating this first panel today. As Whit said, my name is Ann Christianson. I am the Director of International Climate Policy at the Center for American Progress. I'm also very excited to welcome Dr. Rod Schoonover and Sherry Goodman to the stage, who are two leaders in the issue of natural security. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the Stephenson Ocean Security Project for holding this event on an extremely timely and very complicated issue for policymakers, an issue which crosses the lines between ecology, climate science, geopolitics, defense, and development. I want to highlight two of these issues to kind of lay the groundwork for the conversation today, and that's the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. So at the end of last year, as many of you know, countries came together twice in the space of a month to tackle these two crises. First at the UNFCCC Climate Conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and then at the Biodiversity Conference, the CBD COP15 in Montreal, Canada. The Climate COP received a lot more attention, although limited progress was made in Sharm el-Sheikh, and while the Biodiversity COP resulted in a global biodiversity framework, which is a set of commitments that countries have made to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. This framework decision that they have reached is described as a Paris Agreement for nature. So this lack of attention to biodiversity loss, which is personally annoying to me, as that is my main background, is fairly typical when we're comparing these two crises. Over the last 6 months, we've all been inundated with the images of extreme weather events, from the flooding in California that's happening right now and Pakistan late last fall, as well as the wildfires in Europe last year and the drought in East Africa. These are just a few examples of the 29 separate billion-dollar extreme weather events that have occurred in the last year. But nature loss is a much quieter crisis. It's the silent species extinctions that we are letting pass us by. It's the creep of development into natural lands, and it's the increasing amount of plastic pollution that is entering our waterways and our oceans. But the cumulative impact of all these factors is really terrifying. Right now we are facing an extinction crisis. 1/8 of all species on Earth are threatened with extinction. This is at a higher level than at any point in history since the time that the dinosaurs went extinct. Human actions have altered 3/4 of the land-based environment and 2/3 of the oceanscape. As many people in this room may know, we are seeing 90% of marine stocks are fully or overexploited, and 99% of coral reefs will experience dieback with 2 degrees of warming. We're currently on track for 2.4 degrees. The fallout of marine degradation is clear when we think of the fact that 40% of the world's 8 billion people live in coastal areas, and 10% of the global population is reliant on fisheries for their livelihoods. So, because we all rely on ecosystem services and they're the foundation of our economies and our well-being, it's really important for us to understand how their loss can contribute to human, national, and global security. And while the concept of climate security has received a lot of attention, both with this project, from those on the stage, and many of you in the room, the security implications of nature loss are much less well understood. So for the last year, I've been working with our panelists, dozens of others, including some colleagues at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and we've been working on a project we're calling the Natural Security Initiative. This work builds on the past efforts in this space by individual researchers and NGOs and government officials, and we're working to better understand this nature security nexus. We're trying to move the discussion beyond the traditional links that we see between nature and security, whether that be IUU, which we are discussing today, but also things like poaching, wildlife crime, and transnational organized crime that's fueled by natural resource extraction. Instead, we are exploring how socioeconomic and biophysical drivers of change really undermine the ecological integrity of nature, which can result in security threats from pandemics like COVID-19 to armed conflict. We're also exploring the entry points that policymakers and government officials can leverage to avoid and address the security threats resulting from climate change. So with that, and to talk more about these connections, I'll introduce Dr. Rod Schoonover. Dr. Schoonover is the founder and CEO of the Ecological Futures Group, which examines the natural, security, and societal dimensions of global ecological change. He's currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Previously, he served as Director of Environment and Natural Resources and Director of Global Health at the National Intelligence Council, and as Senior Scientist and Senior Analyst in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He's also held past teaching and research positions at Cal Poly and Scripps Research Institute. So with that, I will turn it over to Rod.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you to CSIS for inviting me. It's good to see my friends on stage and in the audience. I spent a decade in the intelligence community of the United States looking at issues of ecological and environmental change as inputs to foreign policy and national security issues. One thing that struck me, so I'm a physicist by training, I would, as someone who was trying to inject science into security analysis, I would, on a daily basis, go to the largest clandestine database in the world available to intelligence analysts, which brought me up to speed on the security happenings on an hourly basis, oftentimes. At the same time, I was reading and consulting primary scientific literature, which I thought was an important thing to do if you were going to inject actionable and current science into analysis. And one thing that I noticed, so I came to DC to work on climate change. One thing I noticed was that the tone that was coming out of the ecological sciences community was shifting, and I would just ballpark it right around 2011, 2012, when the tone from this community was, I would call it desperate in terms of recognition, in terms of the loss of ecosystems and species. And we can talk all about those statistics, but really what I want to do is just, I have 4 or 5 slides, just kind of talk about maybe the framework of how one might think about resource sustainability, resource sovereignty, in terms of security. Before I move to the next slide, I think it's important just to put a pin in that word resources. So my title at the National Intelligence Council was the Director of Environment and Natural Resources. And so very often, environmental security, especially as operated and as actualized in the United States security community, has oftentimes been resource security. So historically, natural resources really sort of meant water, arable land, agricultural crops, and sometimes fish. So when we're talking about marine resources and using the same word, resources, that we do for largely abiotic systems, we should pause and recognize that the resources that are coming out of the marine systems are fundamentally different than the resources coming out of the ground, like from metals or minerals. So for one, marine resources are mobile, not always, but largely mobile. That creates a lot of geopolitical issues when they're on the move. They are living, and so they can act, they can make fundamental choices about how they operate. But most importantly is that they're part of a network. They're part of an ecological network, right? When you pull metal out of the ground, you don't disrupt, at least to the same degree, a system that you do when you pull out an active node in a network. So we should think about and be cognizant of the fact that this type of resource is different. It's interconnected ecologically and it's interconnected sociologically. And so when you think about removing these resources from the ecological network in which it participates, it's not really a question whether it has effects, but really what are the effects and to what degree. And so that's just the riffing on the word resources, because I think it's important. When you look at the security issues around marine systems, you very often times turn to IUU fishing. And I think a lot of people in this room have worked extensively on IUU fishing. When I was in the National Intelligence Council, we were asked to prepare a document on the implications of IUU fishing. This was a 2016, what we called a white paper. Although I was the drafter of it after it's coordinated by 17 intelligence agencies, it no longer has an author. It came out the same day as our implications of climate change paper as well. So that was a busy couple months for some of us. I think it got a little buried by the end. Yeah, so, and one of the things, so when you start looking about the national security implications of IUU fishing, a lot of these are familiar to people, but just what we saw in 2016, which was obvious to us and ongoing, heightened tensions between and within countries. We see that. I have a Google alert that I set up in something like in 2014 on fishing and conflict. And I get hits daily off of that, particularly increasingly in Latin America, West Africa, Oceania. Threats to economic interests of a nation and also livelihoods of the people. So this can intersect with national security, particularly the national security of those nations, and also livelihoods of people who are displaced. Undermining the rule of law, a lot of this is enabled by corruption. That corruption in itself is a security issue. It also hinders the US way of conducting international affairs. We like to promote the rule of law. We like to abide by it, typically. Going along with that, a vector for forced labor at sea, and increased risk of maritime piracy. And that paper has a lot of illustrations of all of those. But the very first one that we listed was this one, adverse effects on critical ecosystems. We thought that was the most important one, and food security. The problem with that particular sentence or phrase is it's hard to drill deeper than that. Right? We intuitively know, I think everyone intuitively knows that messing with critical ecosystems probably has a boomerang effect on people. The question is, how does it boomerang? And that's really a lot of what Anne was talking about, the Natural Security Initiative. How do these things manifest? And so the bigger question here, like when we're looking at IUU fishing, and the geopolitical components and the criminal parts and the corruption parts and the human security part, are there implications for security from just the ecosystem itself, right? In terms of decline of ecosystem health and ecosystem integrity, must we always attach it to a geopolitical dimension? And so that's a lot of work that I have been doing since I left government in 2019. It's really, how do you connect ecosystem integrity? So after all, these are protected areas and species for a reason, right? It's because they provide something to people. And so I'm not sure we can see that very well, but this is sort of a skeleton version of the Natural Security Initiative framework in a flow chart. But basically the idea is you have socioeconomic drivers of change, biophysical drivers of change. Climate change is one of the 5. So, and that has an effect on ecosystem integrity. And somehow that moves over potentially to have effects on human security, maybe through harm, maybe through food or water stress, national security, maybe through boundary disputes, geopolitical clashes, maybe global security if it's affecting shared transboundary resources, or even wider scale conflict that might boil over. And so how do you get from the left-hand side to the right-hand side? Which is this ominous question, right? How does that work? We know that it probably works, but how does it work? And so the idea, stealing this idea from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, or IPBES is how I usually say. They transformed this concept that's been around for about 20 years of ecosystem services, right? These are the benefits, sometimes financially constructed benefits that societies and people draw from nature. Stealing that idea, so IPBES kind of reframed this as NCPs, divvied them up into 18 categories, and the argument is maybe looking at this is a way to think about how the loss of nature or the change of nature, it's not always a loss of nature. There's some organisms, for example, who are thriving quite well in this change. Big jellyfish swarms, for example, macroalgae, harmful algal blooms, for example. So just breaking that down, this is really not a slide of answers, it's a slide of questions in terms of, so I've stolen the 18 NCPs from IPBES, and the argument is each one of those in principle, and a subset will be relevant to the maritime domain, right? So soil is less relevant. But things like detrimental organisms, control of those, climate regulation, regulation of ocean acidification. So basically looking at this broken down version of the different ways that nature operates and interfaces with humans and societies to further investigate and articulate the impacts on human security, national security, and global security. So this is really, as I said, more of a research agenda, a framework. But even though ecologists and environmentalists know about ecosystem services and even NCPs, while working in the security community, I found very few people in the security community. It may round to zero. It's not zero, but as big as the security community is in the United States, it might round to zero. I think it's an important way to think about the interface between changes, ecological changes, and security. And then I'm happy to answer and talk about more things.
Great, thank you, Rod. Given us a lot to think about, and maybe for folks who want to learn more about IPDIS, I don't think I pronounced that correctly either, but there is a extremely long report from a few years ago, but also a very concise summary for policymakers that you can read if you want to dig into those NCPs a little bit more. So before questions, we're going to move to speaking with Sherry. So Sherry Goodman has a deep background in these issues as well. She is currently the chair of the board at the Council on Strategic Risks and Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. In addition, she holds high-level roles at the Center for Climate and Security, the Wilson Center, the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board, the Exim Bank on Climate, Council on Climate. And previously, Sherry served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security and as the President and CEO of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership. I had to pick and choose from her bio to focus on. She's also received numerous awards and honors over her career, so I'm very excited to have her with us today. So we'll have just a little bit more of a discussion about these issues, and to kick that off, I want to understand, given your history working on security issues for several decades, can you describe to us how the approach to climate security and natural security within the U.S. government has evolved?
Okay, thank you so much, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with my dear friend Rod. And thanks to WIT. You know, WIT and the Ocean Security Initiative here at CSIS is really an example of how the convergence of national security and environment and ocean security, and we'll get into the broader natural and ecological security in a moment, has occurred. I mean, here we are in the pillar of international security studies here at CSIS. There's a plaque out there to my first boss, Senator Sam Nunn, Democrat of Georgia, who is a trustee here. And if any of you know him, he was a very distinguished national security and defense leader throughout his career, chaired the Senate Armed Services Committee. And while most people don't associate him or the president here, John Hamry, who was also a staffer on the committee, I was the first female professional staff member on that committee, associate either of them really with environment. Senator Nunn created something called the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program in 1990 at the end of the Cold War. And that's just a piece of the history. I'll take you back now in the convergence. Just give you my argument is that over the last at least quarter century, and you can take it back even further, we've seen a growing convergence in traditional national security and what I call environment, climate, and what will lead into ecological security as they've come together. I didn't bring my slide deck today because Rod's slides were good enough. So you could go back to the first Earth Summit in '72 at the height of the Cold War, when the principal threat we faced in national security that Senator Nunn, who had just been elected to the Senate in '72, faced, and I was a young kid, was a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. And we characterized that as a mad world, mutually assured destruction. Now, if we think of, we moved towards the end of the Cold War, which, officially ended, between 89, 90, Berlin Wall came down in 89, 91, and then you've got the Rio Summit in 92, okay? And you've got that summit, if you think about that global summit, that had some of the elements of biodiversity. You had President George H. Walker Bush talking about the importance of biodiversity, ecological protection, environmental degradation. And when I came into the Department of, when I came into the Department of Defense in 1993, we were working a lot on natural resource protection for the 25 million acres of land that the Department of Defense is steward of, the second largest landholder, and we recognize that, and we're responsible for protecting the fragile ecosystems, many of which survive better on military lands that's not subject to development, like the greatest stand of longleaf pine left in America is on military bases in the southeast, and the Mojave Desert ecosystem is more intact around military bases. And we were also dealing with an era of a lot of dealing with contamination, cleaning up military bases and the like, and really the first era of kind of looking globally at what is the connection between traditional national security threats and global environmental change. Global environmental change at that time, with Al Gore really as the vice president and sort of the environmental conscious of the administration, was not only about climate, it was the early days really of thinking about climate change, but it was also, in his mind, thinking about, and others, what we now call the biodiversity crisis. We didn't call it crisis at the time, but if you looked at what the State Department was doing in that era, led by former Senator Tim Wirth, who was Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, his science advisor was Tom Lovejoy. And Tom Lovejoy was a renowned conservation biologist. They spent a lot of time in the Amazon, and Tom, and I, and others, and our military leaders, the Southcom commanders at the time, General Wes Clark, were about sort of how do we better protect these important ecosystems because we know they are connected to our security. Now, what's changed? That's just an example of then to now. I'd say this convergence has continued. What has changed over the last quarter century, I'm going to take kind of 4 dimensions of it. First, the science has, and they're all part of this convergence theme. The science has obviously advanced and progressed. We now talk about convergent science. So the physical science and the social science. We understand better how natural systems and human systems interact. And although we still have, I'd say, a way to go in sort of integrating that across both our siloed bureaucracies and our siloed university and educational systems, there has been progress made. And also when we talk about the marine systems, we have much better understanding today of ocean atmospheric interactions that inform a whole range of predictive capabilities and scientific discovery that we didn't have a couple decades ago, that is occurring throughout our oceanographic and atmospheric research institutions. The second thing that's really changed, and this has come out very well, I think, in Rod's slides, is we now have a much better systems approach to the connections between the ecological systems, Earth system science, and human systems, and then our national security systems as traditionally conceived. We talk about, illegal fishing is somewhat a case in point, because we see that the connections there to our national security risks because of not only raping the marine ecosystem through illegal fishing, but then promoting illegal activities which connect to human trafficking and drug trafficking and others are very evident. And there are many other areas. So we have much more of a systems approach. Then we have a sort of technology has advanced in this way so that it's often dual use. And as Rod and I were just discussing, sort of remote sensing now has enabled a whole world of transparency that we didn't have before. So we can see the transparency we want often in national security systems for purposes of tracking missiles and kinetic threats often connects with the kind of transparency we want to track changes in the environment and the ecosystem and global monitoring. So there's a convergence in the technology space. And then finally, in the operational space, and I'm so pleased we have a real live Coast Guard operator who's going to be here on the next panel, and I think we also see it in your counterparts in the military today. You understand deeply in the sense of military and associated Coast Guard and Marine operations how both the threats and the response need to all be connected. And so the training, the practices, and the technology implementations and the systems have all advanced in a way that just enables everything to be more connected today than in earlier eras.
Thanks, Sherry. So you've already a little bit moved us away from the historical to the current challenges. And I'm wondering if you could kind of riff on that, systems approach a little bit, and speaking about the connections between security, sustainability, and sovereignty, which Whit mentioned in his introduction, and kind of what are the risks and opportunities we see in the maritime space for tackling natural security with those three factors in mind.
Right. Well, I'd say, the Coast Guard's on the pointy edge of the spear on that, because we see that sovereignty of many nations is being undermined when their ecosystem integrity is undermined. If you take from a combination of illegal fishing or the existential climate risks that Pacific Island nations and some other small island states face, their very sovereignty is threatened. I'm going from here to talk to a group of Australian parliamentarians who also want to talk, who are in Washington, D.C. in part because they want to talk about the national environmental and ecological security connections in down under, where they're both existentially threatened from fires and floods in Australia, but also are very deeply humanly connected with the small Pacific Island nations from the COFA states of Palau, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia to Fiji and others. And then we also see, then there's the China piece of this sovereignty threat in the Pacific region, where some of our traditional allies like Fiji and the Solomon Islands have become more allied with China in recent years. And that leads me into why I'm so passionate about the convergence and the deeper understanding of these connections, because we will only be able to counter and manage the growing Chinese influence in the region if we understand the ecosystem roots, the ecological and natural security systems that are so fundamental to our allies and partners in the region, and integrate that into our security assistance, security cooperation, our entire network of foreign and national security policy making in that area.
Great, thank you. Do you see that happening right now, or do you think that that is an opportunity for growth in how we are addressing these issues?
Well, I think there are a lot of good things happening. I mean, we talked about the Maritime Safe Partnership. There have been the Pacific Island forums early this year, kind of laid out some of that. I think the policies are great. I think the policies are good. The enthusiasm is good. I think that our financial support to these nations often lags, and that's a problem because traditionally, security assistance is underfunded, and we need to, unless we can figure that out better as a nation, it's going to undermine our overall security posture in the Asia-Pacific region.
Great, thank you. Pivoting a little bit, when you were mentioning the Pacific Island states, they're very vulnerable to climate change and they're vulnerable to ecological degradation. But I want you to maybe pivot to what we consider fragile states right now and the connections between fragile ecosystems and fragile states, and what practitioners in the security community should really be thinking about when they're looking at working in regions that are really dependent on these ocean resources.
Yeah, thanks, Ann. That's a great question, because my good friend, Ann Witkowski, is now the Assistant Secretary of State for what's called conflict and stabilization. And that portfolio in state, the authorities that drive that portfolio are something called the Global Fragility Act, which defines for authorities in the U.S. government what are fragile states. And they released, the State Department released earlier this year its list of about a dozen fragile states, what are termed fragile states under U.S. authorities. That includes Haiti, Libya, Mozambique, Papua New Guinea, and 5 countries in coastal West Africa: Benin, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, and Togo. Now, all of those countries are maritime countries. All of them are, so there is a convergence now between what we think of as fragile states. I think the concept sort of evolved, and the whole authorities of that office in state, which actually grew out of conflict and stabilization after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but has now kind of shifted to understanding that, and if you take Haiti as sort of a primary example, where you've got a very a government that's historically been very fragile for lots of reasons, and has had corrupt and insoluble domestic politics, and a history of oppression and other things that we can, but also has it has a very degraded natural resource environment, and a probably degraded as well marine environment. And if you think about the coastal African countries, many of them are subject to illegal fishing as well. So I'd see, so they have maritime risks. So there's an opportunity both to address and integrate how we assess the risk for fragile states, what they need in terms of not only governance systems, human systems, and security systems, but sort of the broader ecological and natural systems approach. And I think the challenge is, as we get into this, is to say exactly what it is that governments can do and where there are other sources of support. Because unfortunately, this portfolio, like we just discussed about, it's important, and it's also historically underfunded. So the resources of the US government to sort of fix any of these very substantial problems in those countries I just identified is in many ways very limited. And so I think, in the same way that we've seen in the climate space now in the last few years, this massive mobilization of private capital and philanthropic capital to undertake many of the transformations we would like to see that maybe in an earlier era would have been more funded out of the public sector. I think in this area too, Ann and Rod, the challenges we're facing are going to have to come from a greater mobilization of private and philanthropic capital.
Thanks. I would like to maybe speak with you later about what that would look like, because we have, the last 2 years actually, the public dollars for climate change have been almost non-existent in terms of appropriations. So looking more towards private and philanthropic capital is a necessity at this point. Lastly, and I think I took my New Year's resolution too far and completely unplugged from my phone, so I don't have a time check here. But, oh, there it is. Thank you. So I want one more question for Sherry, and then we'll open it up to the room and to those online. But one thing that Rod and I have been discussing a lot lately, and that I've had discussions with other folks, is how to integrate the nature security nexus and the climate security nexus, and whether or not we should, if we integrate nature into climate security, will that kind of have it be subsumed in the bureaucracy, or if we need to have it stand alone to bring attention to it? So I'm wondering if you could give your advice based on what you've seen on how you think that this should be approached, and are there risks to either side of this debate?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think there, you know, there are pluses and minuses. I certainly agree that I think conceptually there are a set of ecological natural security challenges, the biodiversity crisis, for example, that cannot be fully addressed just by having aggressive climate goals and going to net zero and transforming our energy systems to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it wasn't as if just the election in the US of President Biden really woke people up to it, but there was a convergence of the urgency of the need and the opportunity to actually do something about it at the time. So the politics converged with the better policy. Now, we don't have a Congress that will support that, sort of raising that up right now, particularly in the House. I mean, we have some of the right champions in the White House. I would say John Podesta would love to sort of be the champion in the White House for this portfolio, even though he's got a slightly different one now, but it is an area which you know, and from CAP, he's very passionate about, and he is good at sort of mobilizing a lot of things across an interagency. But whether that would sufficiently shift resources and sort of the public attention may not be yet the right time. I mean, if you look back historically, these things come in waves, and the time was right in the 90s, let's say, to more deliberately tackle, you know, environmental degradation and contamination and really clean up sites, clean up our water, reduce air pollution, reduce water pollution, and soil contamination through a set of laws then, and now the time is right to really transform our energy systems and tackle the climate crisis. The time is right, of course, to tackle the biodiversity crisis, but I don't know if the politics yet are right, but I think there are things that can be done to establish more of the support that will be needed in the future. And I would note that, you know, and it's only one of the examples, and there could be more, but there's been a lot of bipartisan support for climate, energy, and even ecological support in the defense bill over many years, because members from both sides of the aisle often see a stake for their bases and their troops. And so when we can make those connections, that's one of the starting points. There are others in the intelligence community, and also, I think, in the DHS and other areas of authorization and appropriation, and also connecting the needs, the passions of particular members on both sides of the aisle to their needs. I mean, there have been many conservative Republicans who have cared about food and health. I mean, you think of PEPFAR, I think, is a good example of a program that worked well and has led to PREPARE. So what's the program that's going to be in this space? That would be the challenge. And you'll probably design it. That's my guess.
Well, thank you very much, Sherry.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, of course, Rod.
Just my time in the national security community in the United States, you know, sometimes, you know, it's good to reflect back and ask, well, what is the national security community for? What are these enormous resources that are put into the national security community? What are they for, and whose security are they intended to protect? And so I think we're in considerable danger underscoping the risk presented by a changing planet if we ahead of time cut off certain domains, right? If we can't see, for example, harmful algae as a security issue, as something capable of doing acute social disruption, then the task that the security community is charged with, which is to assess risk and provide strategic warning, already off the bat, if it's not somehow embodied in the doctrine, you're already underscoping the risk. And if you don't properly scope the risk, it is very difficult to get to effective policy, including national security policy. And so, from my perspective, security professionals, again, the policy side, there are different policies for fisheries and flagging and coastal protection, but from a security standpoint, you should assess risk from all places, engage them.
Thank you, Rad. I really like the way that you have characterized that we really need to adequately scope the risk to get the effective policy, and I think that that is what we've been talking about here today may be missing in this space. So now we can open it up to the room. We have microphones over here for folks who want to ask a question, and then I will take while people get sorted in the room, I'll take the first question from online. So question from Aldo Simone from the Italian Navy. Do we need more ecologists in the security community or more security professionals in the conservation community? I'm going to add my own addendum, or both.
I'll jump in first. Hi, Aldo. Yeah, it shouldn't be an either or, but if I had my druthers, if I had my pick, if I had to choose, you need more ecologists in the security community. The inability, it goes back to properly scoping risk. So in my time in the US intelligence community, which is big, if someone asked me who's the expert on sustainable lobsters, I think I know where to go, but I don't necessarily know the people, and I'm not certain that they, it's oftentimes Office of Naval Intelligence. But a question on the limits of deforestation, the limits, how about this invasive species question? There are scientists in the national security community, but they reflect a different time. It goes back to what Sherry's talking about in terms of convergence. The emergence of the importance of some fields of science, Earth system science in particular, is not always aligned inside of the personnel and the structure of the national security community. I'm talking about the United States security community primarily, but all the other country security communities that I have engaged with, I would argue there's the similar issue. It doesn't hurt to have people who understand the security world in the conservation space as well. It helps them with their language oftentimes. But if I had to pick one, I would push for more scientists across the field, particularly ecology, disease ecology as well in the community.
And Rod, would you take a broader definition of security community? Because right now, the State Department is putting climate professionals in the Foreign Service in certain countries that are particularly at risk for climate change impacts. So would you include the Foreign Service and development in this definition of security community and bringing experts in that way?
Absolutely. So the idea that the security community equals the military is a enormously important component of the security community. But that time, we left that time decades ago. And it's always, the State Department, diplomacy has always been a component of any country's national security development. And especially when you think about things like state fragility. And I would say increasingly I consider federal science agencies to be a part of the national security community on the issues we're talking about. And so I think, on particular issues, they should have a seat at the table. Sometimes they should be chairing the meeting. So I'm speaking as a scientist, of course.
So let me, if I can add to that, because I've been sort of a translator between the science and security communities for decades now, and a connector. In the Department of Defense, as just an example, in the 90s had more biologists in its natural resource programs than the Department of Interior. And it was better funded in many ways to protect the natural resources on military lands than the Interior Department was to protect them on Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, BLM, and other related lands. So whether that, you can decide whether that's good or bad, but those were focused on, on the ecosystems of the particular, military bases and places. Now, you see we're in an era where there are climate scientists being added, for example, across Intel, Defense, State, USAID. In Air Force Weather has hired a climate scientist, and you've got oceanographers in the Navy who, in that community, who also understand climate changing ocean maritime system dynamics. And at the State Department, I'm the vice chairman of the International Security Advisory Board, and I'm leading a study that's looking at how to integrate climate and ecological and natural security into the international security portfolio of the State Department, which includes security assistance programs, political military support, arms control, and a range of international security agreements. And so it's really the first time that the State Department is asking itself that question: how do ecological and natural system and climate risks affect what we are trying to do in terms of our arms control regimes and chem, nuclear, and bioweapons? So that's more of the need for that convergence.
Well, it's good to hear that they're doing that, and I look forward to the output of those conversations. Question in the room.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mary Eileen Manning. I work for Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, and I work on international ocean and environmental issues. I found the discussion this morning so far really fascinating. And I was wondering whether you had some thoughts on a kind of a critical minerals issue that we wrestle with every day, but it hasn't converged as we're hoping it is. As you know, Canada is an excellent source of many of the critical minerals, and their Canadian mines are increasing. And for our U.S. securities perspective, this is a very good thing. U.S. and Canadian companies are often cross-owned, so it's good economically as well. And also for renewable energy purposes, many of the minerals are in Canada, and thank goodness they are. But there is a very concerning ecological point to this. The Canadian mines are often very environmentally responsible with some very dramatic concerns. Some of the mines that have sat along the western border and sat in Alaska are horrible and have been environmentally degrading those border areas, particularly with fisheries, for years. So on the one hand, I think the U.S. wants more mining with our great partner, but the conversations about national security and critical mines and renewable energy and also the environment are usually three separate conversations with three very separate groups of people discussing them. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on how to converge this to make sure everyone wins in this regard.
Who wants to take that question?
I'm not familiar with that particular issue, but I am familiar with the historic siloing between mining activities, the ecological community, and even the renewable energy communities, and I would even throw the indigenous communities are also often in a different discussion. But we invented systems thinking for a reason, right? Or we stumbled upon it. We know that mining, particularly in some parts of the world, mining is the primary disruptor of ecosystem integrity. And so, the humanity has this tendency, I'm going to fall on physics here for a second, on optimizing on one variable. Let's maximize our fish catch, our crop yield, the number of minerals that we pull out of the ground. And the other dimensions, we'll just ignore them. But in a systems approach, you would balance the mineral intake or uptake with the ecological damage. Now, again, I don't know about that particular system. Recently, while I was at the State Department, the unsustainable mining community converged, to use the word of the hour, partially with the so-called traditional conservation community in addressing issues of unsustainability and the blowback when you don't have that.
Okay, good to see you again, Mary Ellen. Thank you. That is an excellent question. And so the security issues that are driving the need for greater extraction of green, what we call the green minerals and rare earth minerals, is the fact that the energy transition is dramatically increasing demand for lithium, cobalt, and other rare earths, many of which are the supply chain for which is found today most often in China, Congo, and so the U.S. is overly dependent on our adversary for the minerals, some of the materials we need to drive the green energy transition. Now, I agree with, I think we can, the Defense Department at least, and I think there's maybe actually, it might be an administration policy, is looking at these issues. How far it's gotten, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure, but there is a whole increasing focus on sustainable mineral mining activity. And if you go back to the Arctic Council has actually had a working group on sustainable mining that even in some ways predates the whole focus on the urgency of what we now call friendshoring for to reduce the over-reliance on China, because I remember that from some years ago now. And so there's been a focus in the Arctic nations, among the Arctic Council nations, of how to do sustainable mining. So we need to marry what we've learned from that community with the need to increase our supply through our friends, Canada, or our own, of the minerals that we need and materials we need for the green energy transition. It's a great subject, and I'm glad that you and Senator Sullivan are taking it on. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question if we keep the response to that question relatively short. So last question here in the room.
I have a question that I'll frame in two different ways. When it comes to combating nature insecurity, what items, resources, or assets are on your wish list? And alternatively, what items, resources, or assets are missing or under-resourced, like anything from Coast Guard cutters to security assistance funding?
Who wants to kick off that one?
Well, that will give me a chance to say what I was my little quip I was going to say earlier, which is when I described that we were in the Cold War, we were in the era of MAD, mutually assured destruction. We've just flipped the letters a little around a bit. We're in the era of MDA, Maritime Domain Awareness. And that leads us to a whole set of technologies and integrated systems that we need to have that complete picture of the maritime domain so that illegal fishers can't hide and others can't hide. And, you know, in other parts of this maritime domain, we can see, we can track, we can enforce. And that, I think those are some of the, we're seeing that now happen very much through the fact that we have such great autonomous capability at all, you know, in the airspace and sea domain now, and you can see how these drone systems are being used very to great effect to track everything from, you know, Iranian illegal things in the Middle East. I mean, and a lot of this is, you know, a lot of this is being, I just saw a Wall Street Journal video piece on it, which was very well done with the Navy, and I think there was Coast Guard in there as well, demonstrating their drone assets, you know. So we can do this in this area. We just have to, we need to invest a little bit more in some of those capabilities for the natural security threats, and that's where I think we should be headed.
I'll be brief. So on one slide, I mentioned national nature's contributions to people as maybe a way to think about how breakdown of natural systems affect people. Unfortunately, we don't have much knowledge, shockingly, about the status of a whole suite. I mean, let's just say practically the entirety of nature. We don't know the status of much of the ecological systems. We know about coral. We know some of the obvious ones. We know a little bit about kelp forests. We know about some about pollination. But I don't think that we understand the danger that we are in until we really get those baselines.
From like the twilight zone in the deep ocean.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes, so that's, you know, for you oceanographers, the twilight zone in the deep ocean is still, as we, you know, we say, it's less explored than space. So we need to invest in, you know, the basic research in those domains as well.
Yep. And to underscore that point, a lot of what we're talking about is very context specific, right? And so data is very poor, especially in non-Western countries, because a lot of people get funding. White-tailed deer are extremely well studied and have very little to do with security. But again, we don't know that much about the ocean, and we don't know that much about the systems thinking and how different species interact with the ecosystems. And if you remove one, as Rod said, and their participation in those ecosystems, how then we'll have cascading effects that then result in the insecurities that we're talking about today. So I think that's a good place to break, and looking forward to the next panel in a few minutes. And I think I hope everyone can join me in thanking our panelists today as we are moving on to the next session.
right, thank you all. Thank you again to our panelists from the first discussion this morning. I thought that was great conversation, and I thought a perfect runway into our second conversation. I just wanted to close the conversation out from earlier this morning a little bit with an observation I had there at the end. I really appreciated both the conversation from Sherry around how thinking in the natural security space has evolved over the last 25 to really almost 4 decades of work in the security community. And how Rod brought up the points about the need to embody the doctrine of risk assessment regarding ecosystem disruption into US policy. And the ways in which we go about that are sometimes opaque. The IC itself, the security community itself can often be opaque, and the mechanisms by which those communities move are even more obscured. But we have here today a panel that I think represents a good example of a clear pathway to incorporating some of those risks, to embodying some of this doctrine in US policy. I'm incredibly pleased to be joined here today by the co-chairs of the Maritime Safe Working Group. To my left, we have Rear Admiral Joe Burdian, the Assistant Commandant for Response Policy at the U.S. Coast Guard. I have Deputy Assistant Secretary Maxine Burkett from the Office of Oceans and International Scientific Affairs at Department of State, and Dr. Kelly Chris, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Fisheries at NOAA. I think we're going to start today with brief remarks by Kelly, who is serving as the current chair, which rotates amongst the three of you, I believe, of the Maritime Safe Working Group, and then we'll flow into comments from Maxine and Joe. And just a brief refresher for those who don't know, the Maritime Safe Act was a law passed as part of the National Defense Authorization Act in 2020 that really set the stage, was the first integrated mandate from Congress for a response to the problem of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And it was the first time the Congress said collectively that we need to have a whole of US government approach to this challenge, and that we need to take begin to think about it as a problem that requires not just the individual mandates of NOAA to deal with illegal seafood, or state to deal with capacity building, or the Coast Guard to deal with operations, but a broader whole of government approach to think about how we might deal with this very complex and multifaceted challenge. And so, as I say, I'm thrilled to be joined here today by these three tremendous officials. And with that, maybe I'll pass it off to Kelly to kick us off here. Tell us a little bit about what the working group is and what you all are doing these days.
Thank you so much, Whit, for the introduction, and to you and CSIS organizing this event. I also want to thank the previous panel for a really compelling discussion about natural security. I took a page of notes, and I'm looking forward to reflecting a bit on what was shared with us, particularly in the context of the work that our agencies, plus another 20 or so, are doing specifically on IUU fishing. It's really nice to be here in person today. It's a pleasure to share the stage. I think we were just saying this might be the first time all three of us are in person together to share the stage with my colleagues. And I'm really looking forward to discussing both amongst ourselves and with all of you our shared priorities on IUU fishing. Whit shared a little bit of the context, but I'm going to share just a tiny bit more context for people in the audience who may not be living and breathing every day the interagency processes that have been established to enable the whole of government response to combat IUU fishing that Whit just introduced. As this audience is well aware, IUU fishing is an insidious problem with impacts that, and I was really pleased to see Anne both mentioned these, and Rod, I believe in your slide, many of these came up. I put this one first: destabilizing healthy ocean ecosystems on which we depend. It undermines food security. It disadvantages those fishers who follow the rules, and also often exposes humans to labor abuses associated with the seafood sector. In my mind, it not only requires a whole of government approach by the United States to overcome, but a global commitment by countries, industry, NGOs, and many other partners, since the scope of the problem is global in nature. As Whit just mentioned, starting with the United States, in 2019, Congress established the Interagency Working Group on IUU fishing to meet the challenge of coordinating the country's vast counter-IUU fishing efforts. The working group brings together the efforts of 21 U.S. federal agencies for an integrated, whole-of-government approach to combat IUU fishing and its related threats. Its purpose really is to coordinate U.S. counter-IUU fishing tools, support comprehensive approaches to combating IUU fishing, and also prevent the import of IUU fish or fish products into the United States. What does that really mean, though, mechanically? The working group sets up mechanisms for agencies to share information, pool their expertise and efforts, provide technical assistance, and collectively work with foreign governments and the private sector to combat IUU fishing and strengthen maritime security. As Whit mentioned, the working group is currently co-chaired by NOAA. NOAA currently holds the chair, but we co-chair with my colleagues here on stage, the U.S. Coast Guard and the Department of State. And the role is shared amongst the three agencies. The role of chair is shared amongst our agencies and transitions every 3 years, and we're coming up on that transition this year. In the first 3 years, the working group's priority was to finalize a 5-year strategic plan, which was released in October last year. And if you haven't taken a look at that, I encourage you to go take a look at it to learn more of the details, since I'd rather have a discussion with all of you than get into the weeds on what's in that plan. But at a very high level, the plan aims to make tangible, targeted progress to combat IUU fishing globally by working to address the problem at its source in a series of identified priority regions and priority flag states and administrations. The objectives of the strategic plan are threefold. The first is to promote sustainable fisheries management and governance. The second is to enhance monitoring, control, and surveillance of marine fishing operations. And the third is to ensure only legal, sustainable, and responsibly harvested seafood enters trade. Beyond the 5-year strategic plan, I believe there is more this group can do together. For example, the group is tasked with overseeing and coordinating the activities detailed within the National Security Memorandum to combat IUU fishing and associated labor abuses, released last summer in late June. In the interest of brevity, I'll just conclude my remarks with a quick overview of the specific roles and responsibilities that NOAA has in combating IUU fishing and associated labor abuses. Through various authorities, NOAA's efforts are focused in 6 different areas. The first is advancing worldwide sustainable fisheries management. The second is detecting IUU fishing where it occurs. The third is improving traceability of imported products. The fourth is preventing IUU fish and fish products from reaching markets. Fifth, imposing consequences for IUU fishing. And the final one is to collaborate to address labor abuses. With that, I'm going to wrap it up so that we can hear from my other colleagues on this stage and get to the Q&A. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Kelly. Maxine?
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Great to be a part of this conversation. I'll just say a couple more things about the Maritime Safe Working Group, and then really speak to what state's contribution largely is and will continue to be. So again, the Maritime Safe Working Group coordinates U.S. government efforts, right? And we're doing that through diplomatic outreach, law enforcement partnerships, information sharing, international capacity building. So you can kind of get a sense of why the 3 agencies that you have represented on the podium right now, or rather on the stage, are sort of part of this rotating chair and leading this interagency process. There are 20 other agencies, government agencies, that are meant to address these efforts with respect to human rights, environment, rule of law, trade, security. We're doing something that is also going to advance and is probably the primary mechanism for implementing and advancing the priorities that were laid out in President Biden's National Security Memorandum on IUU fishing. We're a key body for organizing efforts that are new, and then, of course, those older ones that can have additions to them to be more effective as we address the evolving issues that related to IUU fishing. But at state, our focus is on mobilizing missions in priority states and regions and coordinating and building in-country actions that support countering IUU fishing and the priorities we have associated. And through our U.S. missions, we can develop and deploy public diplomacy tools, direct foreign assistance toward counter IUU fishing priorities, and leverage interagency programs to improve weak fisheries management regimes and minimal enforcement through the post-IUU fishing working groups. Beyond that work, organized under Maritime Safe, the State Department combats IUU in multiple other ways through improving fisheries and ocean governance, supporting enforcement efforts, enabling that productive information sharing mentioned as one of the priorities, and aiming to raise ambition to end IUU fishing globally. So I'll pause there and hand it over to Admiral Burdian to talk about the Coast Guard engagement.
Thanks, Maxine, and thanks y'all for having the Coast Guard here today. So in the last panel, Sherry gave a little bit of a history lesson just for some context, and I thought I would spend just a second or two doing the same thing so that everyone understands who your Coast Guard is. Your current Coast Guard is a conglomeration of a bunch of previous organizations: the Revenue Cutter Service, the Life Saving Service, the Lighthouse Service, the Boiler and Steamship Inspection Service, and really your modern day Coast Guard that's moved through the Departments of Treasury, Transportation, and now Homeland Security. And I think we're just shy of a month away from our 20th year of being in Homeland, is a mature organization of full-time maritime law enforcement and military professionals who really bridge the gap between the Department of Defense and our other partner agencies here in the U.S. government. And together with our partners at all levels of government, we save lives, we defend the homeland, and we preserve the world's oceans, including the vital living marine resources that we're talking about here today. And by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't say we're hiring. And the truth is, many of the world's maritime services, whether they coin themselves navies or coast guards, really reflect the size, mission, and authority of the U.S. Coast Guard. And so that puts us in the unique position of being able to engage directly with those nations and conduct joint law enforcement operations via shipwrighter agreements, or conduct training and capacity building to put them in a position to protect their own ocean. And that's happening every single day, from Oceania to the Galapagos to the Gulf of Guinea, where we work with partners and allies every single day to try and have a combined effect in this critical mission space. We're grateful to be part of the Maritime Safe Act working group, and lovely to see my co-chairs here today. We really have never been in the same place at the same time. The Coast Guard has been in the enforcement game for a long time, right? Like years ago, our primary concern with regard to fishing was the use of high seas drift nets. And we didn't conduct operations in that space alone either. But really what the construct of the Maritime Safe Act does is really coordinate and combine our efforts so that we are all focused on the same things at the same time in the same way. I'm of the opinion these are all leadership problems. You don't have to be sick to get better, but really this combined, integrated, whole of government collaborative approach really is just a better way to govern the space and try and counter malign activity and influence globally in the Maritime Commons. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Admiral. That's a great segue, I think. And in particular, a good opportunity to reflect back on the first panel and Sherry's comments about the evolution in those 4 key areas over the last 40 years, and particularly the systems approach, right? And this idea, I think, that's another sort of dreaded catchphrase of the whole of government approach, which we use a lot, but is actually really quite meaningful. I want to get into a little bit of what the working group has been doing and is thinking about, but I also want to step back maybe at the start of the conversation here and just to reflect on that first panel and translating that into what you all are doing here. and to ask each of you how you think about natural security. And I understand that it's fine if that's a new term or a new concept for you within your mission context. The Coast Guard may be all about it in one way, shape, or form, similarly at State or NOAA. But specifically, I think agencies can often be focused on mandates, right? Because that's how you come to work every day and you think about what is it that we need to be doing based on the mission set and what Congress has told us we need to be doing. But something like natural security is perhaps a little more amorphous, just as the climate challenge is perhaps a little more amorphous. And so how are you beginning to think about, or maybe using the Maritime Working Group to begin to think about these challenges in a broader context, and how IUU fishing specifically, but maybe other related challenges more broadly fit into the broader missions of your agency, and maybe perhaps even the broader missions of the U.S. government when it comes to security policy. So maybe I'll kick it off with you since you spoke last, and we can go back around. That's
Thanks,
okay.
Whit. No, I'm not sure I've heard the term of art before, but certainly it's logically intuitive for a Coast Guard officer. I've spent no small portion of my career working in the Caribbean, and just today there's a crisis of irregular maritime migration that, at least in part, is driven by changes in the environment and ecology and food security, and globally driven also by conflict, which is not unrelated to issues of natural security as they relate to national security. Excuse me. And the other component of what the Coast Guard does is facilitating maritime commerce, and we're a maritime nation that enjoys $5.5 trillion of input to our GDP annually through our ports and waterways. So, protecting the natural resources that reside within our world's oceans and the security therein is really a critical component of our nation's prosperity and as it relates to our national security.
Yeah. Admiral Schultz, the previous commandant before Admiral Fagan, used to speak about how he found in conversations with partners abroad that oftentimes they wanted to talk about fish before they wanted to talk about anything else, and that was an entree and a pathway to talking about other kinds of partnerships and engagements that we could have with them. So.
Absolutely, and frankly, that IUU fishing has replaced piracy is the greatest scourge on the world's oceans.
Thank you. Maxine?
Yeah, thank you. This is such an important question and conversation, and it's actually, I think, very hopeful to see that it's becoming a part of our sort of dialogues like this one. From the State Department perspective, obviously we know that foreign policy or failures in policy and politics can lead to incredible environmental harm. The acute example of that is the war in Ukraine and the impacts that are obviously byproducts, but sort of fundamental to the trauma and crisis that defines it. But it's also true that the context, right, that whether it's climate change or the state of the environment, the various crises that you're dealing with, the cascading, overlapping, are going to shape foreign policy, are going to shape the circumstances in which people are making decisions, good or bad. And so that's becoming, that's always been something that in my previous life as an academic has sort of animated the work and the research and understanding how we got to where we are, but is especially acute now, right, as we are dealing with some of, again, the issues that we see to a head and forcing us to be sort of different kinds of diplomats. So in order to be successful as a diplomat in the 21st century, you really do need to take into account the environment in which you're working. I used to say that to my students: in order to be good lawyers or physicians or executives, you absolutely have to understand the context within which you are operating, and these environmental crises are defining that context, so that becomes really a critically important, not sort of additional consideration, but a lens through which you view a problem and explore the possibilities in terms of solutions. If you think about IUU as an example, just to sort of echo what Joe has said, I mean, we can see now that this is not it's difficult to disentangle it from some of the other security, natural security issues that we are dealing with. And we also see that criminal networks are engaging in nature crimes. And so there's also sort of an important opportunity in terms of forensics to understand why this is happening if we understand the environmental inputs as well.
Great.
I think I approach this a little bit differently. I'm a scientist. I'm a geologist. I am an oceanographer, and I'm a climate scientist. So I approach everything in my life through an integrated lens of how does the Earth work? How is it responding? to the changes. And I think it's important to note that humans are an integral part of the ecosystem that we're talking about. And I think what came out a little bit in the panel before was as we pull on the different threads, how much are we unraveling? And I think we see that happening really very profoundly in the marine environment. And then we can't ignore the connections between the marine environment, the atmosphere, the terrestrial environment, and how we must maintain that interconnected perspective to the work that we do. I find myself in this position thinking almost exclusively about fish most of the day, but I'm able to use that perspective to think what I hope is on a broader scale about how we use the tools we have available to us through the interagency, through the levers and the authorities that Congress has given us to address some of these really global scale issues through the power of the US government. And so I want to bring it back to the question that you asked, which is how do we think about natural security in the context of the MSAFE IUU Fishing Working Group? And I think actually the 5-year strategic plan gets at some of that by taking a regional perspective, recognizing that this is a global issue. The US government alone cannot solve this problem. And so by the approach that's taken in the 5-year strategic plan by tackling the problem really at the source, improving governance in other countries, increasing their ability to patrol and enforce their own laws, increasing our ability to work in consensus-based organizations to address these problems are things that are described in the 5-year strategic plans as really tangible ways that we can address the IUU fishing problem through the collective efforts of the US government, but really applied in the global context, so bringing it back in an interconnected space. And I'll use Sherry's word as well, looking for those points of convergence where we can work together.
Well, that's a great, I think, entree into the conversation about the points of convergence and the priority regions. So the Maritime Safe Act, for those who don't know, mandated that the working group would think about these priority regions and identify places around the globe where it was particularly important to focus energy in this space. I set up the first question to kind of ask this question, which is, there's a lot of very public conversation, particularly in the Pacific, on both ends, in the Western Pacific and then the Eastern Tropical Pacific as well, around the intersection of IUU and regional security challenges. In the Western Pacific, of course, it's a conversation with our island partners and vice our competition with China. In the Eastern Tropical Pacific, China plays a role, but it's not just China. There's other issues with regard to fisheries management and conservation and regional partnerships. And there are other regions around the globe as well, but I think some of the highest profile stuff has kind of been happening in the Pacific. We had announcements coming out of the Quadrilateral Dialogue last May around the formation of Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Partnership. Obviously, President Biden's National Security Memorandum in June spoke to these sets of issues very specifically, and then we had the President hosting the Pacific Island partners here in September and created the Pacific Partnership Strategy. And so I guess why I would, to dive in back a little more directly into the maritime safe work, is to ask kind of specifically about the priority regions and what kinds of things what does that mean for you all in terms of your work, and how do you focus the different department agencies' work in priority regions? And then how do you think about not just your specific agencies, but the collective effort of the Maritime Safe Work Group, because it is broader than just your 3 agencies? And fitting into these larger sort of strategic initiatives by the US government. So maybe a 2-parter there. No, I'll just open it up.
Start. If I can get my audio. Can you hear me? Oh, fantastic. Okay. Thanks. So yeah, I mean, I think just to take a step back and define a few terms, the priority regions are those regions that are high risk and also lack capacity. So that you're sort of meeting at the intersection. Now, obviously, there are a few of those, and so to determine how we are able to prioritize regions, we were sort of assessing the most recent and egregious cases of IUU fishing in in the particular region, understanding where they sit in the seafood supply chain, understanding, again, where we could help with building capacity, and then also where there's opportunities for meaningful sort of interaction, engagement, and relationship with the United States. And so the Pacific is a sort of perfect regional example of all of those things. Again, understanding that there are many high risk and places that lack capacity, but our opportunity to work with the countries in the region is particularly high there as other places. So Maritime Safe is a whole of government effort. Elements of that will be these specific engagements as well. So there are quite a few. There's the Partners in the Blue Pacific, there's the IPMDA that you referenced, there's the Indo-Pacific Strategy, there's the Pacific Partnership Strategy. We're pulling all of those together, not wanting to duplicate efforts in any way, but sort of harmonize efforts, and existing efforts like those will be, again, key parts of that whole of government coordination.
Excellent.
Is the mic you specific, or is it all of us now?
It's a me.
I think
Just
it's
Maxine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just add, because we haven't named the priority countries that were detailed in the 5-year strategic plan. 2 of them are in the Pacific region. Those are, and one of them is in administration, but Vietnam and Taiwan. Also Panama and Ecuador and Senegal. That's meant to be a growing list. And I do want to emphasize that those countries were not designated because they're the worst offenders. But because they expressed a willingness to work directly with the United States to address the problems that, as I mentioned, this is an approach in which we work with those who are willing to address the problem and address the problem at its source. I work at the Department of Commerce. Sometimes people forget that NOAA is in commerce, and so I would be remiss if I didn't mention another piece of the Pacific, the overall Pacific strategy, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is actively being negotiated and includes a trade pillar that will also include sustainable fisheries as a piece of that. So there's even one more aspect of the focus that the Biden administration has in the Pacific region. And I think I'm going to keep reflecting back on the, in many cases, the lead off in a conversation, particularly in the Pacific, is through the lens of fish as the primary currency. And it's striking when you visit the region how much this plays a role in the economy, in the food security, in the culture for the countries. And I'll add that another piece of that is an ongoing and I think increasing conversation about the role of climate change in not only how that resource is changing, but how that really global scale change is changing the nature of these countries. I had the opportunity to go to Kiribati earlier this year. You can walk across the country of Kiribati. It's a city block, and here in this country, we're faced with, Anne said it, I don't know, $21 billion disasters this year. And we're experiencing the effects of atmospheric rivers. The most recent climate assessment determined that much more than 50% of Americans have already experienced the effects of climate change. But when you go to a place where you can actively see how a wave could go over a country, it's very, very profound. How different the concerns are for livelihoods, culture, and just how you interact on the world stage. So as we think about these countries who are so dependent on fish and the destabilizing effect of something like IUU fishing to that really fundamental pillar of how those countries are sustaining themselves, I think that those are things that as we think about the Quad, the NSM, the Pacific Strategy, the IPEF, and how we, as the 21 agencies who comprise the MSAFE IUU working group, how are we coordinating our efforts to address those problems, again, at the source through the 5-year strategic plan. But really, I think there's a fundamental thing that we're getting at through this discussion on natural security and what that means as climate influences all of the discussions that we're going to be having.
So I have not been to Kiribati, but I was in Hawaii last week. And, you know, in speaking with the operational commander out there, and that really is where the Coast Guard lives within the Maritime Safe Act work group, is on that tactical edge in terms of the monitoring and control and surveillance in these spaces. It is an absolute upfront stated goal of the operational commander in the 14th Coast Guard District to really focus on getting to some of these very, very small island partner nations to do everything from provide training and capacity building in this specific space, but also things like outboard engine support so that they can get out into their own waters, and really to demonstrate the unwavering support of the United States Coast Guard as a whole of Coast Guard effort to be present and give these partners the ability to learn from us and for us to learn from them, but also to give them, in our absence, the ability to be effective in maintaining domain awareness and patrolling their own spaces and maintaining the rule of law in their sovereign waters.
Great. So the Pacific, we've just talked, Kelly, thank you for laying out even more of the various strategic initiatives we got, Commerce and others as well, in the Pacific. And I think in some ways the focus is natural. We obviously have the shift to the Indo-Pacific theater more broadly. We have a very dynamic competition happening there in the Western Pacific and increasingly the Eastern Tropical. But it's not the only region in the globe. With these challenges and with, it's both, I think, important to recognize that there are common themes in other places around the world, but also important that we don't just map solution sets to other regions because those are, well, the theme is the same. So I guess this is maybe a general question to all of you, which is to say, what are the lessons that we can take from the Pacific, or Western Pacific in particular, and apply it to other regions? What are the kinds of things that you think have been successful or less successful, and how might we be thinking about applying those other places around the globe, and maybe what are those places as well?
Right, so I think we can recognize the diversity of regions and needs and the commonality of experience in terms of, you know, we're sort of at there are different front lines, obviously, for the experience of climate change, for example, and again, the biodiversity crisis and the ways in which IUU intersects with all of those things. That is shared, and we have varying levels of sort of exposure in terms of time and intensity and impact on our economies, for example. We have to be mindful of the differences there, and mindful of our relationship in those regions. And I'm sort of previewing a little bit. I can see the questions ahead of us. But we, for example, have another regional engagement, which is the Eastern Tropical Pacific, and our work with the Marine Corridor, CMAR. That is an effort by, I think, a very forward-looking and necessarily ambitious effort to create swimways between the countries of Costa Rica, Panama, Ecuador, and Colombia. And how can we best support that effort? That's sort of a specific way in which we've sort of seen the needs, a great idea that was created regionally that is of the region, of those countries, and we can support in terms of wraparound efforts with respect to law enforcement, with respect to building a governance regime, and being a partner in that, not leading, but sort of being able to support from behind and create an infrastructure that allows for the best chance of success of that swimway over time. And, you know, obviously one of the threats would be IUU fishing. How can we be, again, partners in helping with maritime domain awareness, for example. So whether it's the initiative itself, the countries, the regional needs that we need to adjust to, I think that's what certainly our approach has been, and some of our sort of chief efforts in the last year and a half have been in that spirit.
I really love that example because I think that you hit on a key point there, which is meeting folks where they are. That's something the President's mentioned before, and the idea that being a partner does not necessarily mean leading in the same way that we think of in all parts of the world. And so I think that's a great example. I don't know if either of you want to reflect on that. I know the Coast Guard has been operating down in that part of the world recently.
We have been, and I think success breeds success, and we did really have an operational success. One of our larger Coast Guard cutters, Coast Guard Cutter James, was conducting law enforcement boardings off the coast of Ecuador, and was denied boarding. And through your partnerships with the U.S. government, but really through also the international engagement, the government of Panama deflagged 32 vessels based on those operations, right? And that's a long chain, and it takes an incredible amount of engagement and support. And really, we are at the operational edge. We're observing and informing and inspecting. But I think that kind of operation really can inform and inspire others to do the same, to really focus on accountability when there is malign action and influence in these spaces, understanding the critical importance of these resources.
Right.
I'll just briefly add that not for nothing, 2 of the CMAR countries are priority states in the 5-year strategic plan. So you see a nice convergence here.
That's great, and that's exactly the kind of thing I think we're trying to get at, which is how are we feeding into the work of the working group into these broader strategic initiatives by the U.S. government as a whole. I'll do maybe 1 or 2 more questions here, and then I want to make sure we get to audience questions here and in the room. Shifting gears a little bit, we've so far been talking about sort of outward projection, working with partners. The other way that the U.S., I think, has, in some ways, the biggest impact on the global sustainability of global stocks, of seafood supply, is as a market state. We are, of course, a market state on seafood. I'm not going to get into the specifics of the various regulations out there. I think there may be other questions out there that'll come forward about that. But just to acknowledge that there are some regulations that NOAA's got out there right now to revise our seafood import monitoring program. And other market access control systems that we have. But I would note, and this is going back a little bit, one of the key moments in elevating IUU fishing on the domestic stage was a little more than 10 years ago, a signing of a joint statement between then NOAA Administrator Dr. Jane Lubchenco and the DG Mare Director in the EU, Maria Dominaki, about working together on IUU fishing. A lot has happened since then. Our thinking about IUU fishing has evolved significantly over the past 12 years. Began to think in particular about the intersection with human rights abuses and labor rights abuses at sea. Began to think about the security implications of IUU fishing. And the currency of fish as a diplomatic tool, if you will. We've also had, of course, the EU has a market access control system in place. Japan now has a market access control system in place. What do you think about going back and revisiting that joint statement? What do you think about taking the opportunity with, for example, the recently concluded agreement with Japan on supply chain transparency and human rights, and thinking about working together collectively as the 3 largest market states in the world to develop a set of common standards for market access for seafood?
You want to go first?
I'll just say that that's a great idea. I think you teed us up to share that. But I'll actually hand it over to you, Kelly, to say more about the specifics. But of course, we'd be open to that kind of collaboration and efforts that are moving in that direction.
I'll echo that I think there's real merit in having that discussion and looking to other market states. As we alluded to in a little bit in each one of our comments, it takes many, many levers to get at the problem. And so one of those levers is market access. And so from all accounts, I have only been in this job for a little over a year now. But my understanding is that US-EU agreement is working. It enables the conversations that need to be had. In my role leading U.S. negotiations on fisheries, I see the value in talking to our partner countries, our adversarial countries in some cases, depending on what the topic is, and trying to find that consensus, but also finding those global scale solutions to address these problems that are without boundary. And so I hope that we can have those discussions, and I hope that we look broader than just those three. As you probably know this off the top of your head, what market share does that represent? U.S., EU, Japan?
It's over 50. Yeah.
So there's some solution space to explore there.
Okay. Well, I think we will turn now to questions online and from the audience. And we've got one online from Angelo Paule from the East-West Center. What is our strongest argument to assuage partners if they feel like increased ecological engagement is ultimately for traditional U.S. security of keeping access in the Indo-Pacific? So kind of the flip side of securitizing nature. And this is, I think, an interesting topic as well, teeing off this morning's conversation and getting into a little bit of the work that you all have been doing in the Pacific.
Yeah, I can address this. I mean, I think this is an important question with respect to motivation that I think we'll get a lot, and we should be open to that conversation. The climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, the environment, the state of the environment and its impact on our livelihoods is a clear priority for the administration. So I think it is as true to say that this is as much about that priority than anything else. I think what will be key as well is in any region that we work in, but specifically in the Pacific where we have a longstanding relationship, where we have a strong presence, it's really important that we are listening, that we are partnering in a way that is I've described in terms of thinking differently about what it means to engage in a role that is supportive, that is a catalyst rather than just defining the future that countries want. I think it's important that what we do is a sort of no strings attached, right? We're going to partner. This is the right thing to do, and it benefits the countries and the world as a result of our relationships. I also think we can't have intermittent relationships. It cannot be sort of a stop-start, and that is probably some of the wariness you'll see in the Pacific. But this engagement is certainly from what I've seen in partnership with other agencies and the administration in the Pacific Island Summit that we had is a real commitment to a long-standing relationship, a real reset that allows for that to be one that is really rooted and hopefully multi-generational in a way that's I think appropriately responsive to the threats that we're facing.
Yeah, great. Other comment? No. Okay. All right, Sally.
Can you hear me, or do I need to get closer? How's that? Yeah? Okay, great. So thank you, and thanks CSIS for this tremendous panel. The administration has just done such a great job at highlighting IUU, combating IUU fishing globally. For those of you who don't know me, Sally Azell from the Stephenson Center. I run the environmental security program. I've just taken a lot of notes, and as you did earlier, and when we think of environmental security, it really is about economics, both domestic and international. It's environmental, and it's human security. And when we helped devise the working group, the task force, working group, we put all three of you as chairs for a good reason: operations and training, and really markets and science and management and diplomacy. And it's thrilling to see all of you working so well together. The Biden administration, having put together the national security memo, was tremendous, and implementing it, and the work you're doing is all really great. But I want to just note a couple things that, Kelly, you had said, which I think is fabulous. Your 6 priorities, 3 of which is traceability imports, preventing IUU fish from entering markets, addressing labor abuses, and that's fabulous. NOAA did just come out with a seafood import monitoring program rule, kind of during the dead of night between Christmas and New Year's. It's slightly increased the number of species, and at this pace, I'm going to be gray and gone by the time we get to a lot more species. So we're hoping that would be up a bit. But I just want to highlight, when we did this previously, when we created the SIMP and we worked on the task force, we really had a lot of transparency going on. We had, I think, something like 4 or 5 public meetings. we really got a lot of input, and that's something we haven't seen a whole lot of lately in this program. The program's doing well. It's got such an opportunity for growth. But you know, it seemed like it was about this rule. I know you can't talk at length about the rule, but it's as narrow as possible. You know, it's a limited number of species. It seemed to come under an economic threshold so that there didn't have to be interagency review. Didn't go through your other 21 members or however members of the committee. You know, labor, which is a priority, is not touched on it at all. So I guess what I would love to ask you is, do you think moving forward, as we're in the comment period, someone could have some sort of a conversation with the stakeholder community where we could ask questions? I mean, there was something like 44 species under review. I think 5 or 6 were picked, and no one really understands why. We had 7 criteria, and it seems like 4 were cherry-picked. So I think it would be really helpful for the stakeholder community, both industry and NGOs and the research community, to just get a better understanding of how we got where we are and how we can go forward improving it. So that's one question to Kelly specifically about, can you help us get a public meeting, hearing, to really be able to understand. And then the second question I have for all of you, you know, you have this working group, task force, and where are you going forward? I mean, you've talked about it specifically, but again, in the transparency, is there an opportunity to bring the public in, to bring the stakeholders in, to have an engagement, to hear specifically how we can help with those priority regions and countries? We work in all of them, and I think we could really be helpful. And lastly, I just want to comment on the IUU Action Alliance, which we think is terrific, and I know we want to work with Maxine to, again, same thing, help push forward these regions so that they can have this harmonized effort that Whit was talking about. So I'll stop there. That was a long speech, but wanted to get it out and see if we can get more transparency and discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, as with all questions SIMP related, I'm probably going to be a little bit disappointing. I cannot speak to anything with respect to the active regulation, but what I can say is, you know, NOAA in the NSM specifically committed to a continuous expansion of SIMP. This was us delivering on that promise initially through the expansion. And as everybody in this room probably knows even more than I do, it's a risk-based program, and I'm just going to direct specific questions to really NIMFs, and specifically the Office of International Affairs, Trade and Commerce, who oversees the SIMP program. It does not fall under my portfolio of international fisheries issues that I deal with. That said, I will commit to taking back your suggestion to my colleagues and asking for them to consider sorry, I don't have my glasses on and I took notes without my glasses, a conversation with stakeholders. So that's something I can take back, and I'm sorry for the unsatisfying answer. It's, I feel like everybody expects it now. All right, anybody else want to throw in on SIMP? Okay.
Well, I think we're talking about what's next.
I have the what's
exciting.
next, yes.
Yeah.
So anybody want to kick off the what's next conversation?
Go ahead while you're still.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, our focus in the first 3 years really was developing that 5-year strategic plan, and that was outlined in the language of the legislation. But I think that we're moving into a period where we're a little less bounded. We obviously have to implement the 5-year strategic plan, and we're moving into that. But I think as we think about the coordination, the opportunities, we have an opening to really think about that in a less constrained way. Think about what's within the realm of possible. Think about, to your point, who's amongst the coalition of the willing here. There is the ability through the working group to work with the private sector, to work with NGOs. We are not limited to the agencies solely listed in the law or that are participating. So I think public-private partnerships is key to our success, and so I think that there's opportunities to do some exploratory conversations and work with others to define what's next, as well as having those conversations amongst ourselves. But I'll hand it off to my very able co-chairs here.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Kelly for so capably leading this team and in the first few years of its development. That's the hard part, so thank you. We are getting ready to transition to a new co-chair with Maxine taking the helm here, and I think, you know, the implementation, like I'm a coastie, right? So I've kind of always got my hand on the throttle, and so I really am so excited to be part of the team to figure out how to transition from, you know, the strategic plan to an implementation strategy so that we really can articulate success and progress and a way forward as we continue, I'll borrow a phrase from our amazing commandant, to sharpen our competitive edge and move into a space where we really have measurable impacts globally in this operational space. So again, thank you so much, Kelly. I'm saying thank yous. I know we only have just a couple of minutes, and I wanted to acknowledge the work you and your team did to really lead this gargantuan whole of government effort to put pen to paper, but also say thank you for taking up the helm here as we move forward, Maxine.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I want to echo your thanks. It's really was a remarkable thing to take, you know, this congressionally mandated effort and move it from concept to a structure. And so, and I'd actually like to take the time to thank my team as well. You know, at the Office of Marine Conservation, this has been a labor of mostly love, I think, over the last many years. But what we're seeing, again, is this opportunity for it to actually have tangible impact, visible impact on the ground. And so obviously, as mentioned, you know, we do the public diplomacy and we do the, you know, opportunities for capacity building in terms of workshopping, and that we're seeing examples of that happening in Peru and other parts of the Eastern Pacific, and we are also going to help to stand up some efforts that are regional, like we've discussed with respect to the Pacific, but also in the Atlantic. We have Atlantic Cooperative Initiative, and we're looking at all of the Atlantic littoral states to really organize around some of the key threats that we're seeing. Of course, we're looking at sustainable blue economies as a response, as a holistic response. We're looking at environmental and climate impacts on the oceans, but maritime law enforcement, IUU fishing is a key part of that. Of the three pillars, I would say, in our bilateral conversations with other countries, it is incredibly important that we are able to sort of, you know, pull this element of our effort and make it one that's robust as a priority, I think, in terms of time and urgency. And so this is the work of the Maritime SAFE as an opportunity to coordinate across the interagency to help stand something like that up. So it is both a period of ensuring that we are able to do the kinds of work in place in a tangible way over the next few years, and then helping to stand up those other efforts that really leverage the interagency.
Fantastic. And I think that, oh, please, Kelly, go right ahead.
If I might just redirect the credit to the team of people that really pulled together the 5-year strategic plan. I've only been in the job for a year. Teams at State, NOAA, Coast Guard, and amongst our other partner agencies, they're really responsible for the product that emerged from that 3-year process, and they deserve all the credit and thanks. So thank you.
Yeah, and honestly, the Office of Maritime Law Enforcement at the Coast Guard is not only responsible for really shaping our voice in that product, but also shaping our global engagements as we do move forward into the implementation phase and supporting you know, our priority nations, but also so many others, from Cote d'Ivoire to Ghana to Senegal to Ecuador, and our partners in Oceania. They really they are far-flung all over the globe at any given moment, in addition to hacking away at their keyboards in the middle of the night at hotels everywhere. So I'm grateful to be on this team, and certainly on that team as well.
Well, what a wonderful note to close on. I really appreciate it. I want to just make a brief reflection here back to the first panel. I think I mentioned it earlier, but I want to come back to it because I think it's really critical. Rod had commented in the first panel, and I'm going to rephrase a little bit of how he put it here, but the need to embody the doctrine of assessing and engaging with risk of ecosystem disruption, right? So that's kind of the fundamental crux or nut, if you will, of natural security. And that we right now, I think, lack very many tools to embody that doctrine, right? And you guys, you collectively, have in your hands one of the tools that we do have through the Maritime Safe Act and through your working group and through your work together. And I think that that's great. And I would just encourage you all, to, as you move forward, to continue to think, Maxine, as you just so eloquently described, about how to stand up the broader what, and think about how to connect this effort to the broader pull and reach of the U.S. government as we think about ways to work to conserve nature and use nature as an engagement tool and a way to support our partners around the globe. So thank you all. Please join me again in thanking this great panel. I really appreciate you being here. And thank you all for coming here online. Have really appreciated the dialogue and conversation today. And with that, we'll go ahead and we'll close out our 4th Ocean Security Forum here at CSIS. So thank you.
Thanks, Whit.